The Red Death had long ravaged the country. Never was plague so deadly or so horrible. Blood was his emblem and his seal, the red horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden vertigo, and then the pores oozed abundant blood, ending in death. The scarlet spots on the body, and especially on the face of the victim, were the stigma of the plague that separated him from all help and compassion from his fellow men. In half an hour the whole process was completed: symptoms, evolution, and end of the disease. But Prince Prospero was fearless, happy, and shrewd. With his domain already half depopulated, he one day summoned to his presence 1,000 healthy and jovial friends from among the ladies and gentlemen of his court, and with them secluded himself in the secluded retreat of one of his walled abbeys. It was a vast and magnificent complex of buildings, conceived by the eccentric, if stately, taste of the prince himself. It was surrounded by a high and solid wall. The wall had iron gates. Once inside, the courtiers, forges and huge hammers were brought in and the bolts were soldered. They decided that there was no way to get in or out if someone suddenly became desperate or mad. There were plenty of provisions. With such precautions courtiers could defy contagion. Let the outside world take care of itself. There were jesters, there were troubadours, there were dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. Inside there was all that, and also security. Outside was the Red Death. It was toward the end of the 5th or 6th month of his confinement, and while the plague was raging abroad, that Prince Prospero gave his 1,000 friends a rare showy masquerade ball. That dance was a voluptuous spectacle. But let me speak first of the halls in which it was held. There were 7 of them, a whole imperial realm. There are many palaces, however, where such rooms offer a long, linear perspective, with sliding doors running almost to the very walls on either side, so that hardly anything interrupts the view along its entire length. The case was very different here, as might be expected from the Duke's fondness for the extravagant. The distribution of the rooms was so irregular that hardly more than one could be seen at the same time. Every 20 or 30 meters there was a sharp turn, and with each turn a new effect. To the right and left, in the middle of the wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window overlooked a closed corridor that framed the sinuosities of the complex, with stained glass windows whose colors varied according to the dominant tones in the decoration of the room to which they opened. The one at the eastern end, for example, was decorated in blue, and the stained glass windows in bright blue. The ornamentation and tapestries of the second were purple, and purple were the crystals there. The third was all green, the same as the windows. The furniture and lighting in the room were orange, the 5th, white, the 6th, violet. The 7th room was a dense shroud of black velvet tapestries that covered the ceiling and walls, falling in heavy folds onto a carpet of the same dye and texture. But only in this room did the color of the windows differ from the decor. The stained glass windows here were scarlet, a deep blood red. Now, in none of the 7 chambers was there any lamp or chandelier, among the abundance of golden decorations that were everywhere or hung from the ceilings. There was no light from a lamp or candle in the entire set of rooms. But in the corridor that wrapped around the rooms there was, in front of each window, a heavy tripod with a brazier of fire that, by projecting its glow through the stained glass windows, flooded the room with light. Thus a striking profusion of fantastic shapes was produced. But in the black, or western room, the effect of the fire through the crystals of blood on the black tapestries was most sinister, and gave such an unreal air to the faces of those who entered that very few dared even to look. A step in that room. It was also here that stood, against the west wall, a gigantic ebony clock. The pendulum oscillated with a low, monotonous, and muffled sound, and when the minute hand had swung around the entire dial and it was time to mark the time, a clear, powerful, deep, and very musical sound arose from its metallic lungs, but of note and quality. Such peculiar emphasis that, every hour, the musicians were forced to stop for a moment to listen to him, which in turn forced the dancers to interrupt the waltz, and there was a brief bewilderment in everyone's joy, and, while the carillon sounded, it was seen how the most frivolous turned pale and the most calm by the years passed their hands over their foreheads as if lost in reverie or meditation. Although when the last echoes ceased, a slight laughter took over the entire audience at the same time, the musicians looked at each other and smiled as if mocking their own nerves and bewilderment, and whispered promises that the next chimes would not cause the same impression on them. But then, after 60 minutes, which is 3,600 seconds of time that flies, the chimes sounded again, and the same meditation, and the same bewilderment and nervousness as before, was repeated. But despite everything, it was a joyous and magnificent party. The Duke's tastes were peculiar. He had a good eye for colors and effects. He disdained the conventions of fashion. His plans were daring and passionate, and a hint of barbarism illuminated his projects. Some would have considered him crazy. His followers did not think so. But it was necessary to hear him, and see him, and touch him, to be sure. On the occasion of this great party, he had personally supervised almost all the decoration of the 7 rooms, and it had been his own taste that had inspired the costumes. Do not doubt that they were extravagant. Ostentation and brilliance abounded, the illusory and spicy, much of what has since been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures, with grotesque limbs and costumes. There were delirious fantasies as only the crazy imagine. There was much beauty, much voluptuousness, much of the bizarre, some of the terrible, and not a little of what might have offended. In fact, through the 7 rooms a crowd of dreams majestically walked. And these dreams stirred through the rooms, staining themselves with the color of each one, and making the unbridled music of the orchestra seem like the echo of their footsteps. And then the ebony clock chimes in the velvet parlor. And for a moment everything is still, everything is silent except the voice of the clock. Dreams remain frozen and static. But the echo of the chimes fades, they have lasted but an instant, and a slight laugh, half suppressed, floats behind him. And the music rises again, and dreams live, and they move from one side to the other more joyful than ever, tinted by the multicolored windows through which the radiance of the tripods penetrates. But in the western hall, none of the masked men now dares to enter, because the night is fading and a redder light filters through the blood-colored glass, and the blackness of the tapestries is frightening, and whoever ventures his steps on the black carpet hears a deaf ticking, more solemn and emphatic than the one that reaches the ears of those who indulge in joy in the most distant rooms. But the other rooms were crowded, and the longing for life beat feverishly in them. Thus the festive whirlwind continued, until at last the clock began to tick. Midnight chimes. And then the music ceased, as I have already said, and the dancers stopped the waltz, and, as on other occasions, everything came to an uneasy halt. But now there were 12 bells that had to ring, and so it happened, perhaps, that as more time was available, the reflection of those in the audience who were already pensive became more serious. And it also happened like this, perhaps, that before the last echo of the last bell had disappeared into silence, many had already noticed the presence of a masked figure that until then had not attracted anyone's attention. And the rumor of this new presence spread from mouth to mouth, and soon a whisper arose throughout the company, a murmur of disapproval and surprise, then, finally, of terror, horror, and disgust. In a spooky congregation like the one I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary attire would have caused such a sensation. In fact, that night the freedom in costumes was practically unlimited, but the figure in question had curled the curl, exceeding even the limits of the prince's permissive taste. There are still fibers in the heart of the most daring that cannot be touched without being moved. Even hopeless cases, for whom life and death are the same joke, believe that there are certain matters that cannot be joked about. In all the attendants, of course, there was now a strong feeling that the stranger's costume and demeanor lacked all ingenuity and decorum. He was a tall, gloomy figure, shrouded from head to foot in the garb of the tomb. The mask it concealed represented the rigid countenance of a corpse so faithfully that the most attentive observer would find it difficult to discover the deception. Still, all this would have been borne, if not approved, by that mad crowd. But the masked man had even assumed the guise of the Red Death. Blood spattered his garment, and his broad forehead, and all his features, were dappled with scarlet horror. When Prince Prospero's gaze rested on this spectre, who was walking slowly and solemnly, as if to make his figure more impressive, a convulsion began, at first with a strong shudder of horror or disgust, but immediately, his face lit up with anger. "Who has dared?" he asked hoarsely to the courtiers who accompanied him. "Who has dared to insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Grab him and unmask him, and then we'll know who to hang from a battlement at dawn." When he spoke these words, Prince Prospero was in the blue room, which faced the east. And its echo ran through the 7 rooms loud and clear, because the prince was a robust and daring man, and one of his gestures had already silenced the music. It was in the blue room that the prince was found, in the company of a group of pale courtiers. At first, when he spoke, they took a first step toward the intruder, who was then close to them, and now drew nearer still, with a deliberate and majestic bearing. But some unspeakable fear which the senseless arrogance of the mask had inspired in the whole group prevented anyone from laying a hand on him, so, without any hindrance, he passed barely a meter from the prince, and, while in the halls the large crowd, as if moved by the same spring, moved to one side seeking the refuge of the walls, the masked man continued walking with the same solemn and measured step that had distinguished him from the beginning, passing from the blue room to the purple one, from the purple one to the green one, from the green one to the orange one, from this one to the white one, and even from here to purple, without anyone make any attempt to stop him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, beside himself and ashamed of his temporary cowardice, quickly crossed the 6 halls, without anyone following him because of the mortal terror that had seized everyone. He brandished a drawn dagger, and he approached impetuously and swiftly, only a short distance from the figure following his path, when the latter, having already reached the velvet room, turned suddenly and faced him. There was a shrill cry, and the gleaming dagger fell to the black carpet, upon which, instantly, Prince Prospero fell prostrate to death. Then, carried away by the maddened courage of despair, a large group poured into the black drawing-room, where the tall figure stood still and erect under the shadow of the ebony clock. But as they laid their hand on the masked man, a nameless horror took their breath away, and they found that the shroud and ghastly mask they had violently roughed were inhabited by no tangible form. And they recognized the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night. And one by one those present in the previously festive halls, now bathed in blood, fell, and each one found death in the desperate position in which he fell. And the life of the ebony watch went out with that of the last courtier. And the flames of the tripods were extinguished. And darkness, corruption and the Red Death took over everything.